Hello, everybody. Nice to be here. This is a new presentation for all the 4 Argo projects. We are going to see not just Argo CD, but all the Argo projects, so the whole Argo family. My name is Kostis. I'm working as a developer advocate for Octopus. I was previously at Codefresh, but as you might know already, Octopus has acquired Codefresh. I'm part of the Argo team, focusing mainly on Argo CD and Argo Rollouts, and I'm the co-author of the first ever GitOps/Argo CD certification that you can find at learning.codefresh.io. So today we are going to focus on the Argo projects. I'm going to make a general introduction, and then we will dive into each individual project and see, what they are doing and what their capabilities. And finally, the most interesting part, the use cases, how you can combine all those 4 projects together in your own company. So let's start with the basics. If you haven't seen this, it's the main website of Argo, all 4 projects, argoproject.github.io. And there you can see all the 4 projects according to their popularity. So Argo CD and Argo Workflows are obviously the most popular ones. You can see the number of GitHub stars. But then we also have Argo Rollouts and Argo Events. So what do these projects actually do? Argo CD is a way for you to deploy your applications on a Kubernetes cluster by following the GitOps principles. Argo Workflows is a way to run workflows on your Kubernetes cluster. Argo Events is a generic event mechanism. And then Argo Rollouts, my favorite one, is a way to do deployments without downtime. Now, if there is one important thing that you need to keep from this presentation is that all 4 projects are self-contained. They can be used on its own. And I'm mentioning this because sometimes I talk, to a company and they explain their use case, and I'm saying, oh, you should use Argo Rollouts. And they answer, no, we cannot use Argo Rollouts because we don't have Argo CD. This is wrong. There is no, dependencies between the projects. You can use Argo Rollouts on its own. You can use Argo Events on its own, Argo Workflows on its own. Of course, the projects, can also work together. It makes sense. There are also some subsystems that they share. So, for example, the notification subsystem of Argo Rollouts is also used by Argo CD. But this is only, on a library level. It doesn't really affect you. Some things also like the SSO mechanism is similar. Like if you know how you set it up in one project, you can set it up to the other project. But it's up to you to decide which projects you are going to adopt. Maybe you want all 4 of them. Maybe you want just 1 of them. Maybe you want 2 of them. It doesn't really matter. They are completely isolated. So this is the project history. Everything started in 2015 by a small company called Aplatix. They created the first Argo project, which is what we know today as Argo Workflows. Then Aplatix was acquired by Intuit. Intuit created Argo CD, which is the second project. Then another company donated Argo Events. And then finally, we have Argo Rollouts. The major milestone that you need to keep in your mind is in 2020, where all 4 Argo projects were accepted in the CNCF, the Cloud Native Foundation, in the incubation stage. And at 2022, they graduated. So now every Argo project is production ready. You can use them today, even in production scenarios. Apart from the main website and the main GitHub repo, there is also the labs repo, and this contains projects that are, let's say, not official Argo projects, but they are emerging projects or incubating projects, and you can find stuff there that is, let's say, being tested right now or being evaluated. Maybe you can find something useful there. There have been cases in the past where a project started from the labs organization, then people said, okay, this is very valuable, let's integrate it into the main projects. For example, Argo Image Updater is a way where you can instruct Argo to automatically monitor, Argo CD to automatically monitor a Docker registry and make a deployment when a new image is pushed. Another interesting thing about the Argo project is that they are not controlled by a single company. There are actually several companies that contribute. Intuit is not, selling anything specific. All the other companies have a commercial product on top of the Argo project. Codefresh is one of the main contributors, and as you know, Octopus now acquired Codefresh, so now Octopus is investing in the Argo project and also a commercial project as well. So why should we care? Why should you care about the Argo projects? Why are they important? this is the graph from the velocity blog post that is published on the CNCF blog every 6 months. And essentially, it shows popularity of projects. The vertical axis is pull requests and issues. The x-axis is commits. And then on the right, you can see number of people or number of contributors. So the way it works is that the more a project is on the top right on the graph, the more popular it is. So here we are looking at on the CNCF projects, and usually Argo is in the top 5, in locations. Like sometimes, it changes, maybe it's top 3, top 5, top 4. In this one, I think it's the 3rd project. So Argo is a popular project in the CNCF ecosystem. Okay, that's great. But for me, the most interesting part is to show this graph. So now we have moved one level above. We're not in the CNCF. We're in the Linux Foundation. So it's all Linux Foundation projects. And obviously, you can see the Linux kernel is on the top right. It makes sense. Then you have Kubernetes. And yes, it makes sense. And then you have other stuff like OpenTelemetry. And even here, Argo is on the top 10. So my point here is that Argo is not just a popular project in the cloud, it's a popular project in general. So this means that several people have discovered Argo, they have seen the value of the project, and they said, okay, we're going to adopt the project in our organization, and then we are also going to invest on it and help with contributions. So at the very least, you should pay some attention for fear of missing out. If so many people think that Argo is something valuable, then you should also check it out and see if it's something interesting to you and for your organization. Okay, so enough about the basics. Let's go into each individual project. Let's start with Argo Workflows. So if you remember, Argo Workflows is the original Argo project. It's a way that you can create processes. And like all the other projects, it's Kubernetes native. So maybe, you have seen similar projects like this before, but they were not Kubernetes native. Argo Workflows started from day one as a Kubernetes solution. The closest alternative or competitor is Tekton. So if you're familiar with Tekton pipelines from Red Hat, Argo Workflows is very similar. And it's completely generic, like you can do with these workflows whatever you want. Some people use them for CI/CD, so a typical pipeline, where you compile code and run unit tests, but you can also use them for machine learning or batch jobs and stuff like this. They are very flexible. You can define a graph of execution. You can have fan out, fan in configurations, loops, barriers, dependencies, whatever you can imagine. So you have a great flexibility on how you will create your process. And because it's Kubernetes native, Argo Workflows essentially describes a new set of Kubernetes resources in the form of CRDs. So you have a resource that describes how a workflow should run, like a template. Then you have a resource for the actual running instance, and then several other resources for other stuff, like run workflows that execute on a schedule. So this is a very simple example. This is a Kubernetes resource that, as you see the name, it's a workflow, and it's super simple. It just says run a single container and run hello world. And you can see the syntax is similar to how Kubernetes deployment would look. So this is a custom resource, not something you get with Kubernetes, but something that you get after you install Argo Workflows. So what is the magic thing here? Other solutions that you have seen, even if they support Kubernetes, usually they have a process where the whole execution happens inside a single pod, which is okay. But Argo Workflows has the capability where you can define multiple steps in the same workflow and have a pod per step. So this means that you have, great capability on how this workflow scales, and essentially you can take advantage of all the built-in capabilities of Kubernetes regarding auto-scaling. So it's not, just like a fancy UI, as you will see, or a fancy way of describing workflows. The big power is the workflow engine that allows you to scale your execution according to your needs and, according to the capacity that you need for each individual step. So as an example, this is actually one example from Kostis. Here you can see we have a massive way of running tests. I think it's UI tests, integration tests in a parallel way. And, we can decide exactly how we're going to spend our resources and the capacity we have in the cluster to see what, steps need the more capacity or steps that don't need capacity. So as I said, you can use it for everything you want. This is an example of a CI/CD pipeline, but you could imagine you can have a workflow for machine learning or something else. Argo Workflows also has a nice UI that allows you to look at your workflows, inspect what they are doing, submit workflows, get some basic analytics and insights. So this is also interesting because it can be used in a multi-tenant scenario. There is also SSO mechanism here in RBAC, so you can have even your developers look at the status of their workflows. Now we don't have time to go over every feature. You should check them on your own, but there are ways where you can decide how artifacts are produced in a workflow. There is a CLI, an API. As I said, there is an RBAC mechanism. So this is just a starting point. Go and look at the documentation and see what other capabilities Argo Workflows have. Okay, so now Argo CD, probably the most interesting project for existing Octopus and Conference users. Argo CD is a deployment solution, and it's Kubernetes native, meaning that not only deploys applications on Kubernetes, but it also runs on Kubernetes. Okay, so unlike some other solutions that you have seen, it supports Helm customize out of the box. It can also run in a multi-tenant environment. And the new thing here is that everything that you see in the Argo UI is live information. It's real-time information as it is coming from the cluster right now. So this is the main UI. Each box that you see here is an application. And in the case of Argo CD, an application is a link between a cluster and a Git repo. And on this box, you can actually see two statuses. One is a green status that says healthy, which means if the application is up or not, and this is real-time information, like the application is healthy right now. And the other status is regarding the sync. So a green check means that what you have in cluster is the same thing what you have in Git. And I'm mentioning why this is important because sometimes maybe you have seen familiar CI solutions. The green or the red status is only important while the pipeline is running. After the pipeline has finished and you have finished with the deployment, the pipeline doesn't know anything just yet. So if after 5 minutes of deployment, your application has an issue, Jenkins doesn't know anything at all. TeamCity doesn't know anything at all. Here, Argo CD, shows you real-time information from the cluster. So when you see a green status, it means that the application is healthy right now, not 5 minutes ago. And then you can click on its application and look at the individual Kubernetes components. And again, the same status here. You can see that this Kubernetes resource is healthy and it's in sync. And you can see also the hierarchy and the dependencies. And this is very nice because some people actually love the Argo UI because they use it as a generic Kubernetes UI. Like they want to understand what are the components of an application. If and after deployment has finished, they are using the Argo UI to look at how it's formed, and some developers use it as well to understand how an application is deployed. So once you adopt Argo CD, essentially you keep your existing CI process. Nothing changes for the CI. You still have your CI system, which can be anything like Jenkins, GitHub Actions, TeamCity. Conference even has a CI system now with Octopus, but still takes the source code, compiles the code, runs integration tests, security scans, whatever. But then instead of having a pipeline step that runs a script or runs a kubectl apply, you remove that step. You don't have this step anymore. And instead, you make a change in your manifests in Git. So you store all your customized files or your Helm files in Git. And then Argo CD is pointed at these Git manifests, and it takes care of the deployment. So the CI part stays exactly the same. The CD part changes by installing Argo CD on a cluster and setting up with links between your Git repos and your clusters. The most interesting feature for Argo CD for me is the avoidance of configuration drift. The big advantage of Argo CD, unlike traditional solutions, is that it's bidirectional. So not only it looks at a Git repo and applies the manifests to the cluster, but it also does the opposite thing. It looks at the cluster and compares the state to the Git repo. So if somebody, let's say, makes a manual change to the cluster, Argo CD will detect it. And you can see here as an example, it will tell you that, yes, the application is healthy. Nothing bad is happening with the application, but it's out of sync. Like what you have in the cluster is not the same what you have in Git. So in this example, somebody changed some ports. So Argo CD will notify you, and then it's up to you to make a decision. Maybe you say, okay, this change happened by mistake. I don't want this change. Please discard it. And Argo CD can be set up automatically, to discard manual changes. Or you can say, oh, we love this change. We need it. Let's commit it to Git. But this is your choice, and you know about it. So not only, you avoid configuration drift once and for all, but you can also, monitor cowboy developers or cowboy people that they go into the cluster and do manual things, either in QA on production. Nobody learns anything about it. I consider this one of the biggest advantages, compared to traditional solutions that are only single directional. They just follow what is in Git and apply blindly to the cluster the resources. So Argo CD also introduces its own resources. As we have seen, the application is the main link between a cluster and a Git repo. There is also the project resource that allows you to group applications and then define security controls for them. And also we have the application set, which is a way for generating a large number of applications. So this is how it looks like. This is, again, a custom Kubernetes resource. It's an application. It has a name, and it has a GitHub repo. So it says to Argo CD, go into this GitHub repo and look at the manifests or the Helm charts or the customized files there. It doesn't really matter. And then apply them to the cluster. Now, application sets are another interesting topic, but we are not going to talk about this today. It will take too much time. I have here an example repo and a QR code that you can go and look at a full example. But essentially, the idea is that if you have a large number of clusters and a large number of applications, you don't want, to create applications by hand. You want to have an automated way to do that. So with an application set, you can instruct Argo CD and say, here, I have 10 clusters. And here I have 10 applications. Go and create the 100 combinations for all the clusters and all applications and deploy them automatically for me. Here I have an actual example. The syntax is not really that important. I have a completely empty cluster. Nothing is installed. And then I apply a single application set, which I think in this case defines 13 applications. Again, the syntax is not that important, but with just this one file, I got 13 applications on my cluster. You can see Argo CD starting to deploy all of them at the same time. So this is great for bootstrapping because I can say, oh, I need a brand new cluster for my QA environment, and I want all the QA applications to go into this cluster at once. You put this in an application set instead of having to manually install your applications one by one. Once you adopt Argo CD, you also need to make a choice regarding the installation. So some people like to have a single central Argo CD instance that controls several clusters, or you can also install an Argo CD instance per cluster. Octopus also offers a control plane for Argo CD instances. There isn't like a correct or wrong solution. It depends on your needs, but you need to do some thinking there, or how you are going to scale your Argo CD usage when more clusters are added. Like Argo Workflows, there are several more features on Argo CD. You can define the order of resource deployment. You can define time periods where no deployments are allowed. There is, again, a CLI and an API, an SSO and RBAC for the UI. There are plugins. There are thousands of things. We don't have time here today to talk about them. You should look at the documentation and see what is offered. But if you want to use Argo CD in a multi-tenant environment, you can do it. Like you can have, an SSO mechanism where a developer logs into Argo CD and they see only the applications they need to see, and they can only do specific actions on those applications. So maybe you allow them, to deploy, but you don't allow them to delete an application. Then we have Argo Rollouts, my favorite projects and the one I'm mostly involved. So Argo Rollouts is a project for doing progressive delivery on Kubernetes. And because progressive delivery means different things to different people, in the context of this presentation, when I'm saying progressive delivery, I mean blue-green deployments. So you have an application that is already running. You launch a brand new version of the application that doesn't get any traffic just yet. So then it's your opportunity where you can run some smoke tests or some unit tests or check other things or the new application. And then you say, okay, everything looks good. And then you make a traffic switch. And now live users look at the new version. And if something goes wrong, you can always, switch back and go to the old version. So that's blue-green deployments. And canary deployments are similar, but instead of having a single, let's say, point where you switch the traffic, you do it in a gradual way. First, you send 10% of the traffic to the new application. You say, okay, it looks good. Then you send 30%, 40%, and so on until you promote all the way to 100%. Or at some point, you say, okay, there is an issue. Let's roll back. And then everybody goes back to the old version. So this is progressive delivery. And I'm mentioning this because if you're familiar with how Kubernetes works, out of the box, you don't have progressive delivery. Out of the box, Kubernetes supports only rolling deployments, where you kill one pod and you launch another pod with a new version, and you have no way, of controlling how this goes, or you cannot stop in the middle. That's one strategy, and the other strategy is the replace one, where you kill all the old pods and you replace them with the new ones, and this also has downtime. So Kubernetes out of the box doesn't support progressive delivery, and this is why we need Argo Rollouts. So Argo Rollouts introduces its own resource, which you're going to see, and it's a superset of the standard Kubernetes deployment, and this is how you do blue, green, and canaries. And there is also the possibility to do some pre and post checks, which is the smoke test or the unit test that we were discussing before. So this is the basic UI. I have started the canary here. You can see on the top left, I'm saying send 20% of the traffic to the new version. And now, I'm paused, so nothing will happen now. Now it's my opportunity for me to run some unit tests, and then I can continue with the canary and send 40% of the traffic to the new version. And then at the bottom, you can see the pods of the new version and the old version and how they are being used right now. So if we have Argo Rollouts, then we can do progressive delivery on Kubernetes. And the way it works behind the scenes is that we use replica sets like standard deployments. So in the case of blue-green deployments, we have a brand new replica set that we launch in the cluster, but doesn't get any traffic at all. We still keep the old replica set running. And then at some point, we make the traffic switch. And it's similar with canaries, but then you can also play with a number of pods and also define the exact percentage of traffic that will go between the old replica set and the new replica set. Argo Rollouts defines its own Kubernetes resources. So Rollout is the main one that we are going to see, which explains how the deployment will happen. The analysis template is one that you can use for a smoke test or unit test to make a decision if the deployment will succeed or not. And then there are other resources like experiments that allow you to do A or B testing. So this is an example of a rollout. You can see at the top, this is a rollout, not a Kubernetes deployment, but all the fields are exactly the same as a standard Kubernetes deployment that you already know, that you should be familiar with. But there is another property called strategy, which is specific to the rollout, and then it defines how the deployment happens. So in this example, I'm saying I'm going to use a canary deployment, and in the beginning, I'm going to send 10% of the traffic to the new version, and then I'm going to pause for 1 hour. Okay, so then I'm going to run maybe some unit tests, integration tests, and then I will continue and send 20% of the traffic to the new version, and so on and so on. This is how it looks. Now, once you adopt Argo Rollouts, there is a major decision that you need to take, which is whether you are going to use a traffic manager or not. So if you are not going to use a traffic manager, in the case of canaries, you have the limitation that the number of pods also defines how traffic flows between the old version and the new version, because this is how the basic Kubernetes network services work. So if you want, let's say, to send 25% of your traffic to the new version, you need to create the new pods with a ratio of 25%. If you want 10% of the traffic, you need to do the same. So there is a limitation there. If you use a traffic manager, and Linkerd is just an example, then you can do whatever you want with the traffic. The number of pods doesn't matter. You can say specifically, I want this amount of traffic to go to the new pods, regardless of what is the number of pods. So this is a bit more powerful, and you can decide what is the exact capacity that you are going to use for the new version. So out of the box, Argo Rollouts supports several traffic providers that you can use, and you can see here it's the most popular ones. But I'm also involved in a project that is adding support to Argo Rollouts for the Gateway API. If you aren't familiar with this, the Gateway API is a new Kubernetes specification, and essentially it's a next generation ingress. It's the next step after ingress. So that is a specification, which means that from now on, every traffic manager that also supports the Gateway API will be automatically supported in Argo Rollouts as well. So check your traffic provider, and if you know it supports the gateway API. Right now, all the major providers support it as well, maybe not in the latest version, but from this point onward, things will be much easier when it comes to traffic providers and integration with Argo Rollouts. So I talked about, the test that you want to do to decide if deployment is successful or not. Our end goal here is to make the deployment fully automated without a human. So most people use Argo Rollouts and, they think the traffic switch is the interesting part. That is not the interesting part for me. The interesting part is that you should also instruct Argo Rollouts to look at your metrics and then have Argo Rollouts make a decision for you if the deployment is successful or not. So you want to make a deployment, on Friday at 5 o'clock, and then you go somewhere else, you go to the movies, you go to the family, you go to the pub, and then Argo Rollouts will look at the metrics, and then it will make a decision and say, okay, everything looks good, let's promote the new version, so all users are on the new version, or no, something bad happened, let's go back and roll back. And the way you do this is with the analysis template, which is one of the Argo Rollouts resources. Here I have a very simple example where I'm saying, start a deployment, and then go to my Prometheus instance where I collect metrics and run this query. And this query, it doesn't matter. It can be anything you want. In this example, I think it counts the HTTP responses. And if 95% of them, are, let's say, not 500, you consider the deployment successful. So this is how I'm saying to Argo Rollouts what success means for me and how it will make a decision if the deployment will stay on the new version, it will roll back in the old version. You can see several other parameters here. I can say how many times I will run this query, when I will run this query, and so on. So like traffic providers, Argo Rollouts also has been built support for several metric providers. So you can use New Relic or Datadog for your metrics, but you can also do something completely custom. So you can run your own custom smoke tests that decide if a deployment is successful or not. So if you have real, humans testing something today, you should put this into a container image and let Argo Rollouts run it for you. And you can also create your own custom plugin. So it's very, flexible on what exactly Argo Rollouts will do to make this decision. As most other projects, there are several other features that I'm not going, to talk about today. You need to look at Argo Rollouts by yourself. But there is also, let's say, a notification mechanism. There is a CLI. You can get metrics for Rollouts itself, and so on and so on. Okay, so last project for today, Argo Events. This is a generic event mechanism for Kubernetes. Like all other projects, it's Kubernetes native. It's not actually creating events on its own. It allows you to connect existing event providers between themselves. And also, if you're familiar with cloud events, it's compliant with that specification. So the way it works is you run Argo events in a Kubernetes cluster, and you can create scenarios where you say, whenever somebody sends an email, then upload this artifact to S3. Every Friday at 5 o'clock, run this Lambda function. When a Kubernetes resource of this type changes, then send a Slack notification. You get the idea. There is also, again, a new set of Kubernetes resources. So a source is where you get events from. A trigger is what to do when an event happens. And then sensors and event bus, they connect sources and triggers. So if we look at a very simple example, you can see here it's a custom Kubernetes resource. It's an event. And I'm saying when somebody makes a post request at /example at port 12,000, then this is an event that I want to do something about it. So this file just defines what an event is, nothing else. And then you have another file, which is my sensor. So I'm saying, listen to those events, the post requests. And when they happen, I want to intercept them. And in this example, I want to start an Argo workflow that runs hello world. So this is a very simple example. When somebody posts something at /example, I run a hello world workflow. And this is how you combine events and sensors. Argo Event doesn't have a UI on its own, but Argo Workflows has support for Argo Events as well. So the combination of Argo Workflows and Argo Events, as you can imagine, is very popular. Both of them are used together most times, and this is how you can visualize Argo events. Okay, so these are the 4 Argo projects, and now probably for the most interesting part, how you actually use them together. And as you can imagine, there are many combinations. As I said in the beginning, the projects are completely independent, so you can pick and choose exactly what you want. So here I have some classic scenarios. The first one is regarding deployments. So you say, I'm going to adopt Argo CD. I'm using Argo CD for all my Kubernetes deployments in all my environments, but specifically for production, I don't want to have any downtime in production. And also I want to control, which users are going to see the new version. So just for production, I choose Argo Rollouts, and Argo Rollouts and Argo CD can work together. So technically, you still deploy with Argo CD in production, but behind the scenes, Argo Rollouts does all the job. But for non-production environments where maybe you don't care about downtime, you just use Argo CD on its own. So Argo CD and Argo Rollouts, a very popular combination. This is also my personal suggestion that at least in production, you should try Argo Rollouts. Then you can use Argo Workflows and Argo Events together. This is also very popular. Remember, I said in the beginning that Argo Workflows is a generic workflow mechanism that you can use it for everything. So here, the top example has the classic CI pipeline. So I'm saying whenever a Git commit happens, and this is from Argo Events, then you start a workflow that checks out the code, builds a Docker image, runs unit tests, integration tests, security scans, whatever, and then I upload the result to an S3 bucket. So this is just basic CI/CD with Argo Workflows and Argo Events. And then at the bottom, I have a different example when I'm saying when somebody sends me a message on RabbitMQ, or maybe I get an email or somebody does something else, then I want to start a workflow where I read data from a database, from a PostgreSQL database, and then I want to process it in some way, and then I'm going to save the result in another database, and then at the end, I'm going to run a Lambda function that does something else. So not, a CI/CD process, but let's say a batch process, all with Argo Workflows and Argo Events. Then another popular combination is Argo CD and Argo Workflows. So usually when you do a deployment in Kubernetes, sometimes you want to do some things before the deployment and some things after the deployment. So maybe before the deployment, you want to migrate a database, and then after the deployment, you want to run some smoke tests or something else. So Argo CD has some basic capabilities on its own to do that. But if you want something more complex, you can also use Argo Workflows. So here I have an example where I'm saying I'm going to deploy an application in my cluster, but before the deployment, I want to take a backup of my database, and I'm going to notify developers via Slack that the deployment has started. So there I'm running a workflow to do this. And then after the deployment has happened, I want to run a smoke test. I want to notify Grafana, and I also want to notify developers again that the deployment has finished. So this is how you combine Argo CD and Argo Workflows. And then you can imagine that you can combine all 4 projects at once. Yay! So this is a similar example, but I have added, all projects. So for the deployment, I'm doing it with Argo Rollouts, even though Argo CD is the main orchestrator. And then I'm also going to use Argo Events for the notifications. So I'm mentioning this because several companies right now are looking at developer portals or developer platforms where they want to give their developers, a nice overview of everything. Maybe, they can use Backstage or Port there, and they are looking for the actual mechanism behind the scenes, like what is running behind the scenes, behind Backstage to do all the heavy lifting. So in this case, you can take all the 4 Argo projects and, use them for a complete solution that covers everything that developers need. So you will find, several popular blog posts or videos that talk about this, how to use all 4 projects together. But as I said, this is up to you. If you just want to use one project, that's fine as well, or 2 projects, that is also fine. And that's it. Here is my email for questions, the certification, and also if you aren't in the CNCF Slack, you should be, because all the discussions about Argo and how the Argo project is progressing are there. You can also find, there the developers of Argo and ask questions and understand more. Thank you very much.